Session one is about approaches to carbon standards and regulation. Um, it will be, we'll have speakers from various different areas of the globe and also talking about different ways that we currently have of carbon reporting. Um, I'd like to first of all introduce Jay Earhart, co-chair of the SEI Sustainability Committee, who will be giving an update on the USA pre-standard for assessing the embodied carbon of structural systems for buildings. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Natasha. All right, lovely. Well, thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to sharing a bit about some of the work that the Structural Engineering Institute, SEI, the Sustainability Committee of this, has been working on for the past 18 months or so. And so we've been working on what we call a pre-standard. I won't get into the details of the difference between a pre-standard and a standard from an SEI perspective, but happy to in a Q&A if necessary. This has really been focused around a standard for structural engineers to assess the embodied carbon of buildings. So a quick overview of what this standard is, and I'll then get into a bit of the details about what is going into this pre-standard. So we saw a need as a sustainability committee where much of the policy, much of the legislation that was coming about in the US was very procurement based. So a lot of buy clean policies targeting individual materials and specifying, global warming impact limits for given materials, and not necessarily treating asset level or building system level limits for buildings or structural systems, as well as then most of the other standards that were in development or have already been published around whole life carbon aren't focused on the designer. They're focused more on the operation of buildings or asset level side of things. And so we saw this need for standardizing the assessment of structural system embodied carbon. So that led us to create this pre-standard. This has been sponsored by the Structural Engineering Institute, so it will be a formal document coming out hopefully later this year, which we'll get into the timeline in a bit. And the purpose of this standard is to set the standard of practice for assessing that embodied carbon of structural systems, as I mentioned. And the scope of this document is really about a calculation methodology. The intended audience is both structural engineers as well as LCA practitioners. And this is something that we've written in mandatory language. So something about mandatory language is its ability to then be enforceable and more adoptable by authorities having jurisdiction as well as owners. So that's one key element that's differentiating this pre-standard from other documents out there, is that it is written in that mandatory language, which is essential for then enforcement. And so we can break down this document into three primary sections. The first one of those is how should materials be quantified during building design and construction. The second piece is how should embodied carbon be calculated and reported. And then lastly, rules of comparison for structural systems on the basis of embodied carbon. While it'd be great to have a standard that can address everything, that's certainly not the possible, especially in the condensed timeline that we have for a pre-standard. So one of the benefits of a pre-standard is it is a more streamlined process from the standards development side of things. Allows a small group of subject matter experts to move quickly on a topic and then develop a work product out of that. And so as a result, it was necessary for some limitations to be made in terms of the scope of it. So the intended use of this, in addition to standardizing how we're calculating embodied carbon of structural systems, was really to support another initiative within the Structural Engineering Institute, and that is the Structural Engineering 2050 commitment. So we'll hear later in today's program some more details from Mel about this, but we're really wanting to ensure that all the data that's being collected as part of this this commitment is being collected in a robust way. So that's the intended use. The scope of this is limited just to buildings. We haven't approached infrastructure yet, just to new construction and just embodied carbon, meaning that the standard is not going to be suitable for retrofits, operational carbon, other environmental impacts other than carbon. existing buildings, and as I mentioned, infrastructure. So that's the high-level overview of what this document is about. And I want to now touch a little bit on some of the differentiators I think that this pre-standard has in terms of its approach to things in comparison to other approaches out there. So I'll really be focusing in on chapters 2 and 3, and then a little bit of 4 of this. But recognizing that there is a lot more than in the comparisons side of things, but for the sake of time, don't quite have enough to get into that. So the guiding structure of this pre-standard is that it's using a tiered approach to embodied carbon assessments. We've recognized that an embodied carbon assessment is being performed for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's to make a decision about which structural system is to use. Sometimes it's just to report the embodied carbon and maybe, have some greenwashing associated with it. Or maybe it's to inform a whole building life cycle assessment. There's many, many different reasons for performing an assessment in the US market today. And if we go back to, the formal life cycle assessment definition or life cycle assessment framework from ISO 14040 and 14044, we know that defining a goal is an essential part of doing an LCA. And then choosing a corresponding scope to match that goal is then essential. And then we have our inventory analysis, our impact assessment, of course, the interpretation phase of these things. But, this inventory analysis and impact assessment is quite standardized. And so we asked the users of the pre-standard to define the goal of why that is that they're performing assessment. And that goal must include what is being considered, the reason for performing the assessment, who's then going to use the results of this, and how those people should be using the results of the assessment. So going back to that formal framework. And then based upon the goal that the user is defining, they're going to then choose a given assessment tier, which then will define the scope that best matches the goal. So the standardization here is getting into the scope side of things, where we have a very simple tier, which is tier 1, a more intermediate tier, a tier 2, and then a much more detailed, whereas a tier 3. And so I'll step into how these tiers are approaching or are flexible in their use for a structural engineer who is completely new to embodied carbon, just trying to get their feet wet in it, which is the case with the vast majority of structural engineers in the US, as well as then how a user that is much more advanced will be able to then adopt this document. So this document's intent is to both educate the novice as well as then be useful then for the data collection for the expert. So a brief snapshot into this, and then I'll wrap up just to give you a glimpse into where the document is at. And so oftentimes in the design process, we don't necessarily know what the sizing and the quantities of all the structural components that there might be in a building, especially say in concept design. And so to do this, we've classified structural components into 3 primary categories. The first one of those is the primary structural components. And so these are those components that are participating in the primary gravity and lateral load paths. The second classification is then on accessory structural components. And these are subcomponents of those primary components. And they can be classified as, for example, materials that are providing connections or attachment, helping provide stability, providing load transfer between primary structural components, or those that might be needed for proper detailing. So things that oftentimes aren't necessarily modeled in a BIM workflow, but still can be significant contributors to embodied carbon. And the last category is that of ancillary structural components. And so these are those that aren't participating in that gravity and lateral load path, but are still structural in some way. And so here you can see how now, based upon these definitions of structural components, we can break them out into the different, in their inclusion in the different tiers of different assessments. So primary are always going to be included across all tiers. Whereas in a tier 1 assessment, accessory and ancillary structural components are optional to include, recognizing that, well, sometimes details about these aren't necessarily known when we want to perform a conceptual or a life cycle assessment in conceptual design, REBA stage 2. Similarly, as we go down the list here, we can consider then sources of materials. So where are we getting material quantities from? Where are we getting data from? Are we using global data? Are we using product-specific environmental product declarations? This is variable, and so we're classifying things out this way. As well as then where we're getting that information from. Is it a manual approximation? Is it a quantity takeoff from design documentation? Or is it true contractor records or procurement that we might have? So just a little glimpse for the sake of time. Can't go too much into details there. So this document currently is finalizing committee edits, and so it'll be wrapped up at the end of the month here. And from there, it'll go out for a peer review during Q3 of this year, within the target publishing by the end of the calendar year. We hope then that this will then have initial adoption early in 2025. And this is the document that we see as being living. It's going to be updated. It's going to, one, be informing the new SE 2050 database that'll be coming online here in the next 12 months or so. We want to extend this to be beyond just structural systems into whole buildings, partnering with our sister institution, the Architectural Engineering Institute, AEI, within ASCE, as well as we want to elevate this to be beyond just a pre-standard to a more formal standard. We're going to be following the ANSI process for that. So that's all the time I have. Thank you. I'm happy to then answer any questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jay. I'd like to now invite Katie Clements-Jackson to speak. She is chair of the technical steering group for the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, and will be giving an update on the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. So please share your screen, and over to you, Katie.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thanks very much. And it's really great to be here. My name is Katie Clements-Jackson. I'm an associate at Coda Consulting, and I chair the technical steering group of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. So I'm here today to tell you more about that and give you an update on where we've got to. So first of all, for those of you that may not be aware of the standard thus far, I just want to give a recap on what its purpose is, what it's been set up for. So the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is a cross-industry initiative. All the institutions and organisations across the bottom are the founding members, including the Institution of Structural Engineers. And those institutions and organisations have banded together to create a robust definition for the industry of a net zero carbon building in the UK. So in terms of the document that we're creating, it's intended to be a technical rule book for how to demonstrate that your building is net zero carbon. It's sectoral, which means it's going to apply across 13 different sectors for which we have collected data that's going to feed into the metrics and the limits that we set. And it's a carbon focused standard, which means we're setting limits and targets around carbon and energy, but we're not looking to address wider issues such as biodiversity, health and well-being, etc. And also to say that this is a science-led standard, which means that we're using climate science to inform the limits and targets that we set as part of our definition of net zero carbon. Just as sort of a very high-level comment that the standard is being created for both new build and retrofit in existing buildings. So essentially, any kind of building should be able to apply for verification against the standard. There's quite a few key principles that are behind the development of the standard. In terms of the more overarching principles, as I've said, we want to provide clear and consistent definitions for buildings in the UK to be able to define themselves as net zero carbon, and therefore also preventing unfounded claims where buildings are perhaps not meeting all the necessary requirements. It's a performance-based standard, so it's going to be based on in-use measured data for operational energy and measured and verified embodied carbon and whole life carbon data. And the aim of introducing this standard is to drive market transformation by giving something for people to aim towards and specify to improve overall work towards net zero carbon in the industry. We're setting out to make it as easy to understand and use as possible, and for the targets and limits to be achievable but stretching. And therefore, by the virtue of the process that we're taking, will be aligning the buildings with what's needed for the UK to be net zero carbon as a whole. A couple more principles that are a bit more on the technical side. As I've said, it's a science-led standard, so we're using carbon budgets that are created from based on climate science to create the limits and targets. I'll talk more about that later on. It covers both operational and embodied carbon, so it's a fully rounded definition of net zero carbon. And not only are we setting these limits and targets, but these have also got the aim of prioritizing energy and material efficiency in design and eliminating the performance gap by measure standard. We're also using the standard to encourage the reuse of existing buildings and assets and encourage a whole life carbon approach. We're also setting a minimum target for renewable energy generation as part of the standard to encourage the adoption of renewable energy and looking to ensure that buildings are responsive to the electricity grid fluctuations. So that's a whole sort of overview of what we're trying to achieve. I also think it's worth mentioning that we didn't start from scratch with the standard. There was a lot of amazing industry guidance that had already been developed by many of the founding organisations and beyond. And we're using all of these as a starting point, and we're also looking to align the standard with all of these industry initiatives and others so that it becomes integrated into the net zero carbon ecosystem, if you will. As I mentioned, it's a sectoral standard, so we recognise that each of these different sectors has different requirements and will have different carbon emissions, and therefore we've collected data and we are setting separate limits and targets for each of these 13 sectors. And these sectors cover the majority of built environment buildings in the UK. So any that fall outside of these boundaries do make up a minimum. I just want to talk a bit about how this standard has been created. So I'm not going to take you through this in a lot of detail, but this is the structure that we've been using in order to run the standard. We have task groups, which are made up of specialist experts in different areas of carbon. So we've got operational, embodied, the sort of top-down budget side, carbon accounting, and the sort of reporting and verification aspect. And we also have expert sector groups who are industry experts in each of those sectors and have helped us to create, to collect the amount of data that we need and also to set the limits in each of those sector areas. That's led by the governance board and the technical steering group. And we've collected absolutely loads of industry feedback through a call for evidence, also through a technical consultation last year and a whole programme of stakeholder engagement. The methodology that we're using to set the limits and targets for the standard is that we're combining top-down and bottom-up. So we're taking carbon budgets that come from climate science of what's needed to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, and allocating a share of that to the built environment, and then reconciling it with this measured bottom-up performance data that we've collected from real-world projects. And we're using a combination of those to set the net zero carbon targets and limits. And just couldn't do this presentation without quickly saying all of this work is as a result of lots of volunteers from across the industry, whether it's people on our task and sector groups, people who have responded to our consultation, people who have been involved in stakeholder engagement or provided us with data. We're extremely grateful. And I'm sure that some of you here today will be in some of those categories, so thank you. I'm just going to whiz through a couple of the key technical principles and then I'll finish up because it's only a 10-minute slot. So just to say, I think this is probably one of the key things to take away. These are all the metrics that we're going to be using on the standard to set performance requirements. The ones that are in sort of greenish teal text, those are going to be set mandatory requirements. So for example, operational energy and upfront embodied carbon. We will be setting limits that you cannot exceed for each sector. And the text that's in white is going to be something that you will be required to report in the standard. So for example, life cycle embodied carbon, you will need to report your A to C emissions, but there's not currently going to be a limit because we weren't able to collect enough data on these to be able to set limits that we knew would be reliable. But we're using the process of the reporting to collect enough data to set potentially limits in future. So this slide potentially is a good one to screenshot and let your clients know what's on the horizon. Also to mention, for the interest of all of you, probably embodied carbon experts out there, we are closely linking the standard to the RICS professional statement on whole life carbon assessment. So the methodology is the same with a couple of tweaks which are going to be set out in the standard, but I won't go into now because those are still being finalised. But if you're familiar with this process, it's going to be the same process with very few minor tweaks to it. I also just want to mention offsetting, which is an option in the standard. It's a voluntary option, so you will always have to meet the standard's limits and targets, which means that you can't use offsetting as a way of therefore not having to limit your carbon emissions, operational or embodied. But you can choose to essentially meet the limits and then also purchase offsetting depending on how you want to achieve the standard. And if you do decide to go down the route of offsets, there'll be some requirements for quality of those, which we'll define when we launch the standard. Finally, just to wrap up, just want to say where we've got to and what's happening next. So this is an overall timeline. So you can see that actually this initiative has been in process for quite a long time. It started out in early 2022. We are currently developing those final limits that I talked about in all of those different categories. We've gone through a whole load of work to collect a lot of data and engage with the industry. And now we're just on that final hurdle, and we're looking to launch the standard in late summer this year. So this is a slightly more detailed program. So where we are at today, as I said, is creating those limits. We're also writing the written content for the standard that's going to be launched, and then we'll be issuing it for testing in late summer. Really, that's my overview. So thanks very much, and please do send questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'd now like to introduce Jane Anderson, Director of Construction LCA, also based in the UK, who will be giving an update on the RICS professional standard on whole life carbon reporting. Over to you, Jane.
Hi everybody, my name's Jane Anderson. I've got my own consultancy, Construction LCA, and I'm talking to you today about the RICS professional standard on whole life carbon reporting, and I was one of the lead authors for the second edition, which is what I'm updating you on. So hopefully you were aware that RICS kind of published a new edition of this, and the timeline here for the first edition came out in 2017. The update was issued in September 2023. There was a very small kind of amendment in November, and we are just about to issue a new version, which will just address a couple more kind of errors and clarifications that we need to kind of look at. But the kind of key part of that is that the RICS actually require all their members, if they're doing whole life carbon assessment, to follow their professional standard. And from that point of view, they're withdrawing the first edition, and the second edition will be mandatory for them from the 1st of July, so just in a couple of weeks. So that will then basically be the only version that they can use. In terms of the changes, I'll run through these in more detail, but there are kind of 6 major changes, and I'll go through those, but you've got a record of them there. So the change is that we're now not just looking at buildings, but we're also covering infrastructure. So there's guidance on how you can do that, how that affects the scope, and the types of aspects you need to look at, and particularly how you address the use stage. So for something like a road, it's quite a different concept in terms of what you've got for B6, B7 and B8 for the operation. So the people using the road would be the users in B8, and B6, for example, would just include the electricity that you're using to light the road. So they're slightly different kind of concepts. But yeah, so we're following, there's a new European standard that was issued, I think actually there's something like 2020, that covered infrastructure. That was a kind of partner standard to EN 15978, which is the LCA standard for buildings. So we follow both of those, although we're taking on board some of the updates that are happening in the revision process. Another change is it's now much more clearly a requirement if you want to do a compliant assessment to actually assess the whole life cycle, not just, let's say, upfront carbon. So you could still use the standard just to report upfront carbon, but you wouldn't be able to claim it to be a compliant assessment unless you're covering the whole life cycle. We are spending more time to explain exactly how you could take account of refurbishment projects and retrofit projects, and projects where you're planning to make a change in the future. So there's a lot more guidance on exactly how you could do that, and to get some consistency in the way that you would report refurbishments. We've provided a lot more default data, and we've spent a lot more time trying to align that with other initiatives, so particularly with BRE and the BRE impact assessment method and their EPD program, where they've got product category rules that provide scenarios for the end of life of products based on the UK. What we've done is work together so that basically all of those will now be aligned, and BRE are also talking about aligning their update of BREEAM and impact to be aligned with the RICS professional statement as well. So there's a lot more kind of consistency in what's out there. And in terms of that, we've also been talking very closely with the iStruct and their How to Calculate Embodied Carbon publication, which will be coming out shortly. And again, we're trying to make sure that that's aligned and that we're linking to the same information, or you're able to use those documents together. Another key difference that we wanted to take into account was uncertainty, and we've broken that down into 3 different aspects, which I'll talk about. But basically, at different stages of the assessment, we're very well aware that an assessment in the early stages will be very uncertain, and then hopefully as you move through the process, the uncertainty should reduce, but we're still asking you to report that. So we have a contingency which basically introduces an uplift to the impacts in the early design stage. You can calculate it more accurately if you have good data, but otherwise there's a default of 15%. And that really just accommodates the fact that we know at these early design stages that a lot of building elements are missed. There's a lot of information that isn't available, so there is very high kind of uncertainty. So we've added that contingency to kind of cover you, so that it isn't a case that as you go through the process, your assessment just gets worse. It should, if you like, now be more close to what you might expect. And as you go through the process, there's no contingency for a post-completion assessment, because you should be using the data that is relevant for the building. And the other aspect is to do with the actual data for carbon that you're including. So the ideal is that you're using specific EPD for the actual product from the actual manufacturer that you're using. But we know that that data isn't always available, or indeed quite often isn't available. This kind of second best would then be to use an industry average EPD, or else to use generic data if that's if you can't access generic or sector EPDs. So effectively, what we're asking is that for and it's only for the 10 key products. So these are the products that have the biggest impact over the life cycle of the the asset. That for those 10 products, you actually assess how representative the data that you're actually using is. So if you were using an EPD, a manufacturer-specific, product-specific EPD for the exact product, then you should be getting a very high score here, and there would be very little uplift. But if, on the other hand, for these most impactful products, you were having to use, let's say, the ICE database for those, then you would get a much lower weighting. And particularly if you're using things like another company's EPD as a proxy, that has quite a low score, because there's no real reason why another manufacturer's product would have the same impact as the product you're using. So yeah, there's a carbon data uncertainty factor that you need to calculate. And then finally, a quantities uncertainty factor. Again, in theory, when you're doing a kind of as-built assessment, you should have very good actual quantities based on actual measurements or delivered quantities. But obviously, in the earlier design stages, you're less likely to have that, or much less likely to have that. So you would get a lower uncertainty factor. And all of those three things come together to give you this, uncertainty factor that you add to your score. And then the final aspect is decarbonisation. So we know that the kind of theory of LCA and EPDs is that you model everything based on current practice. But we're very aware that effectively, if we're not radically decarbonising our built environment by kind of 2050 or earlier, then there's going to be a significant problem. And so if we do all our building LCAs and we don't account for that in some way, then potentially we might be making decisions that are not correct, let's say. So as part of it, we ask an additional scenario that you report decarbonisation of energy and materials. And effectively for materials, for energy, we're using, the kind of the national grid's decarbonisation factors. But for materials, it depends on the module. So we don't decarbonise your upfront carbon, obviously, because that's happening today. But you would be able to decarbonise those impacts that occur in the future, for example, from repair and maintenance and refurbishment. We haven't decarbonised things like waste treatment because those impacts are not, particularly for things like timber, you can't actually decarbonise the transfer of the biogenic carbon, for example. So there are reasons for that. So we've included decarbonisation, and then you should then have two figures, and you can look to see if there are reasons why you know certain paths and strategies might be better in a decarbonised world that don't necessarily look so good in a non-decarbonised assessment. And then finally, we've looked at the reporting templates, and there's very detailed reporting templates now provided, which we hope will give us really consistent information and enable us to start providing benchmarks, not just at whole building level, but for example, per metre squared impacts for facades or structure or kind of fit out. Based on data that we get from as-built assessments. And all that is being done through the Built Environment Carbon Database, which again is an initiative from a lot of the professional bodies and organisations like BRE to develop a kind of database that will not only provide building level assessment data, but also material assessment data. So all of that is aligned, and that's everything. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. And And now for our last speaker, we have Leonardo Poli, who is a life cycle assessment consultant at OneClick LCA, who will be giving an overview and update on global embodied carbon regulations. So over to you, Leonardo.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as mentioned, we're going to go through whole life carbon regulations, a bit of an overview. This is a 10-minute call, and I'm going to try and stick as much as possible to that. Speaking of regulations, one of the many resources that we have available at OneClick LCA is the construction carbon regulations in Europe. This is out now, but it was actually issued in beginning of 2023. I highly recommend to go in, follow the link, or just check the resources, and that will give you a much more detailed breakdown of everything that we're going to be covering today in respect to Europe. But today we're not just talking about Europe, we're talking also about what's happening outside of Europe. Now, for now, we know that in Europe, we are leading the LCA assessment methodology, and market is very well developed and it's very mature. But whilst that's still the most developed market, North America and others are accelerating very fast. You can see there's a snippet of the relevant regulations currently in place in the US, and also a little snippet from one of our resources, again, that you can find online on US Inflation Reduction Act, which allocates, as you can see there, $5 billion for low carbon construction. So there's a lot of movement happening outside of Europe, but as we said, innovation and pushing the boundaries are still for LCA regulations and legislation is still happening within Europe. So today we're going to take an approach or a focus on Europe regulation, just because that's where the really innovative things are happening, and that's where the boundaries are being pushed. But nonetheless, at the end, we're also going to be mentioning all the relevant regulations around the world and highlighting the key factors to consider. And we're going to take, as we said, a global approach. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Let's get straight into the European market. So when it comes to the European market, you can see here a visual representation of the seven regulations that we found in the European market and 6 LCA databases that are in scope. So when it comes to regulations, we can see Denmark, Finland, France, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the UK for London. And the LCA databases are BEPD, CO2 data, INEOS, Okobaudat, NMD, and Boverket. So to review the whole, to do a holistic review of the EU regulations, we actually looked at 12 different countries in the EU where government is active in the space of life cycle assessment. We looked at the market overview, national building regulations, sub-national regulations. You can see the full list that we went through to do a market overview. We identified 7 countries with regulations in place or underway. If things are underway, don't worry, I'll make sure to voice what exactly is going to be underway and when it's going to be applied. But 7 countries were identified out of the 12. Within those 7 countries, we then evaluated the regulation, methodology, and LCA databases. For regulations, we evaluated things such as applicability of the assessment, the timing of the assessment, the accepted data, methodology, the assessment scope in terms of modular elements, standards alignment, data alignment, and LCA databases, the amount of data, generics versus EPDs, data alignment, sources of data, conservativeness of factors. And again, you can see the full list. I'm not expecting everyone to go through all of them, but it's just to give you a context as to how we took on board the review of regulations in Europe. So that gave us the ground to understand what are the key elements that are to be considered for best practice. So you can see here, best practice for regulations are defined based on their decarbonization impact and policy openness. So when it comes to decarbonization impact, timing of the assessment, generic materials top-up factors, compliance type, modules included in the LCA, and material scope of the assessment were key to understand what's good and what's not good. When it comes to policy openness, we reviewed data openness, tool openness, and standards alignment. What came out of it is the a fairly interesting side-by-side comparison of all of the regulations, because this has been an overview. We don't have the time to go into each. And then we applied a traffic light system to just identify whether it's least good, mid, or best. So in terms of timing of the assessment, you can see that we have Denmark and Sweden as post-construction, then single assessment at design, we have Finland, and then the Netherlands and Norway. And then multiple assessments, we find things such as France RE 2020 and London Plan / Part Z, which we can kind of insert there as a with a little asterisk, because obviously it's not into place. When it comes to compliance type, there's only two things that we found to be relevant reporting, aka the approach that we take to calculations and the results that we get out of those calculations. You can either do accounting, so you report against, or you can set limit values. Examples of accounting are the London Plan and Part Z. Limit values are mostly applied in the Nordics, as you can see there, Netherlands, Denmark, and Finland, but also France with the RE 2020. Now, limit values, you can see there in number 1 for Norway, were initially considered but removed. So it's interesting to see a backtrack to the how stringent regulations were. And then you can see there in Finland, actually limit regulations will be, in Sweden, limits regulations will be enforced from 2027. And then number 3, limits regulations, as I'm sure you're all aware, for the GLA are aspirational only. So this is how we reviewed the compliance type. Here is a bit of an overview of the limit values. So you can see that Denmark, we have 12 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared per year, and reported we have the life cycle modules included. Finnish method, we already mentioned that has limit values, and that's correct, but is actually going to be expected to be implemented from 2026. So just something to be aware of, much like the Part Z regulation that's going to be coming into the in place in the future. It's good to be aware. And then we have France, the Netherlands, and the London Plan, which has limit values for offices, residential, educational, but as we said, are only aspirational or not enforced. And then we have the assessment scope, where we found to be of 3 different types. Either it's only upfront, A1 to A5, simplified or whole life, and then whole life. Obviously, the worst being upfront, the best being whole life. And at the very worst, or like the least good end, we find the Climat Declaration. And then where we find the whole life, we see RE 2020 and the London Plan / Part Z. So again, just a bit of a comparison of what's good and what's not as good. In terms of the building elements, previously we talked about the life cycle scoping, life cycle modules included. In terms of the building element, these are the different kind of silos that you can see. Structure and envelope only, again, Climat Declaration, and then significant scope, which is what you can find in Norway, and then whole life, a whole building, which is actually what you can see for Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, France, and the UK. In terms of data openness, this is where we reviewed how restrictive or how open the data was. Very restricted being not as good as fully open, due to the kind of limitations or barriers that you basically put in front of your life cycle assessment for especially smaller firms. And you can see here the distribution again. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm not going to go through each one of them, but hopefully this gives you an appreciation of the distribution of the regulation in Europe. Then we went into tool openness, and actually here we didn't find any prescribed tool, which is very good. But that doesn't mean that you can do it with any database. As we mentioned previously, there are some regulations that limit your database availability. And then SANAL alignment against EN 15804. As a result of all of this information, we were able to provide a clear look at the regulations scored based on the best practice adoption, which is what we highlighted previously. And we divided them in transparency drivers, leaders, and carbon cutters. So transparency drivers, as the number suggests, is very transparent and very open. Leaders are the one that are both very open and strive for decarbonization. And then carbon cutters are the one that are still striving for decarbonization, but are a little bit more closed. An example of this is the RE 2020 in France, where we already mentioned there's prescriptive data to be used. In terms of database, we took a very similar approach to the regulation itself, and we had availability and access as well as cost and quality, which gave us the same kind of quantitative values to then plot these against another graph, which is cost and quality. And I just want to highlight that for cost and quality, they're inversely proportionate. So at the top of that y-axis, cost is at the minimum and quality is at the max, and then availability and access. So the controllers are the ones that are very high in quality, very high, very low in cost, but are not as available and accessible. Leaders are cheap, very high quality, very available, and then laggers are the ones that are behind and have basically no availability, no access, fairly expensive and or low quality. And then we have the enablers that have fairly lower quality, maybe a little bit of a higher cost, and then availability and access, although is very much on the top range. I was going to go through some case studies. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to stop for a second if during the recording you want to see again the details of the Finnish regulation. What's worth knowing is that limit values are going to be included, as we say, in 2026, and the regulation will come into place on the in 2025. Also, is worth raising that OneClick helped massively the Finnish government to develop the values that will be used as carbon limits, and we also helped them to establish the methodology. In London and UK, I'm not going to go through any of this, but it came into regulation in 2022, and I'm sure we're all familiar with the legislation or the regulation in the London area. And also the strive for circular economy that is attached along the whole life carbon assessment that you will need to carry out. And then finally, the all-important Part Z, which should be coming into play or should be implemented in 26, and then for Part Z1 and 2028 for Part Z2, being carbon assessment for Part Z1, and then carbon intensity reporting and reduction for Part Z2. From a global perspective, we have in Canada, Toronto and Vancouver, which are relevant and are already either approved or in place. In the USA, we have California and New York City, which are both approved and or signed. Looking at the global perspective outside of Northern America and Europe, we have in China the Green Building Evaluation Standard from 2019, but actually the draft version has been published in 23. Not yet into place, but it is being developed. And then Green Building Certification Criteria, which is in place since 2021 for public education buildings only in South Korea. Finally, in Australia, we have the City of Vincent, which is in place and required to carry out an LCA and demonstrate emissions to be below the threshold. And then the New Zealand's Building for Climate Change, not currently in place, but will require reporting of LCA emissions from 2025 and carbon limits for 26. Again, if you're interested in reviewing the European regulation in more details, feel free to check out the construction carbon regulations in Europe. And some key lessons is, number one, to have a major impact, building regulatory limits are needed. Number two, the most important thing is to keep the system simple. Number three is to stick to the standards if you want to bring the industry along. And then even a bad regulation is better than no regulation. And I would also add that even bad data is better than no data. And we need to gather that data, whatever that might be. And that actually concludes my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. A lot of information there. Right, if I could encourage the other speakers in the session to turn on their cameras, that would be great. And we have a couple of questions, which is nice. So thank you very much. I see that Jay has been answering them via text, so I'm going to give him a bit of a break and move on to Katie. Katie, we have a question from B Tapley, which I'm guessing is Ben. So hi, Ben. For Katie, as a guide, how difficult would it be to achieve net zero certification? Is it something highly aspirational, similar to BREEAM Outstanding? Or will there be banded certifications, so bronze, silver, gold, to encourage engagement and progressive efforts? How can we get developers to engage with and aspire to this standard? So kind of two questions there, more about like the banding and then, how can we encourage developers?
Yes, thanks for this question, Ben/B. So a few things to say on this. First of all is that we're currently in that stage where we're developing the final limits for the standard. So I can't give a final view on that at the moment in terms of, because we don't have them yet. But I can talk about the sort of the principles and the approach that we're taking with setting the limits. The first one is to kind of come back to the overall goal for the standard, which is to set a definition of what we need for buildings to meet for the UK to be net zero carbon overall by 2050. So within that, that means that it's more difficult for us to offer sort of easier versions, because then it wouldn't be meeting that definition. But at the same time, our goal is to set targets and limits that are stretching but achievable. So what we're planning to do in the current thinking is that the limits are going to be stepped. They will ratchet down over time, so that the overall trajectory or cumulative carbon emissions stay within the carbon budget that we've defined between now and 2050. So the embodied carbon limits are looking to be stepped, and the buildings will need to meet the limit that is in effect at the time period when they start on construction. The exception to this is a new build operational energy, which we will set one limit from the start, because we don't want to, when someone's building a new building, we don't want them to then have to retrofit it in future and emit then the associated follow-up embodied carbon. So yeah, we're sorry, there's quite a lot to say on this. Yeah, so we're ratcheting it for those reasons. We also know that quite a lot is going to change between now and as we get to 2050. So there are things like material decarbonisation. So it makes sense for us to have slightly less onerous targets now, but then ratchet them down as more things become available to us over time. We're also using advice from our sector groups to set those limits and targets, and we're kind of grounding them in the measured data that we've already collected from the industry that we know is achievable. So in that process that we're going through now, we're taking all of that into account to try and set targets that are achievable but stretching. And we're trying, a big goal of the standard is driving market change. So while not everyone may be able to sort of set up to deliver the standard straight away from day one, we're creating a common language and set of metrics and principles that we think can then be adopted, even if people adopt them but don't necessarily meet the requirements. They're all thinking about net zero carbon in the same context and with the same definition, which we think is going to drive industry change. And we're also engaging. So on the question about sort of engaging with developers, we've been doing some stakeholder engagement with developers as well, and also how to integrate the standard with different schemes, which are obviously will appeal to certain developers. And we know that there's appetite from developers to adopt the standard, incorporate into briefs. But we probably haven't spoken to every single developer out there. So this is a request for everyone present to be talking to the developers that you work with and the clients about the standard, and letting them know what's coming, so that we can continue to encourage and drive that market change. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much, Katie. Next question is for Jane. Will RICS be releasing case studies that give examples of calculations and different scenarios? This particular attendee felt like there was certain confusion with interpretation. So case studies do tend to help take people through the process.
I haven't heard that they're doing that, but I can certainly feed that back. That would be useful. Certainly you can, the intention is that people that are assessing to it would report in the BCD, so you would be able to access some information there from existing assessments, but I can certainly feed that back to them. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much, attendee. Hopefully you've enacted change. Next question is for Leonardo. This is from Adam Gravely. I've just lost it. There we go. Did you look at market penetration in the different regions, i.e. what proportion of new buildings in each country have had LCAs carried out?
Well, short answer is no, I haven't looked into that. I think we went through something like 20 regulations. It's not reasonable to review all of those. I think generally speaking, the approach that I've seen for a lot of regulation is that we tend to start from public developments first, where we can put a bit more stringent regulation. That's especially for markets such as Asian markets or maybe the North American markets. That's basically our way in. So I would tend to think that anything that's developed and developed by the public entity is the one that tends to be more assessed under LCA. And then generally speaking, I mean, even by looking at the GLA, the one that gets applied the most, the building type to which is applied the most is probably the office buildings and some residential buildings, but it's usually like student towers. So big developments are definitely the ones that are being targeted, and then also public developments for sure. And they tend to have more stringent requirements, actually, public developments.
Thank you very much. A question for Jay now. How will the SEI pre-standard interact with other standards developed in the US and international spaces?
Yeah, for sure. So the intent for the pre-standard was to focus just on the North American market, since that's where we were seeing the need, and I guess as a subset of that, the United States, where most of the SEI membership is. But we're working alongside the ECHO project, which is another North American initiative, the Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization. And they're working to align all the reporting requirements. So architecture 2030's commitment, SE 2050 commitment, as well as then working with the upcoming or forthcoming ASHRAE standard 240p. So it's a bit messy in terms of lots of people are working in different areas, but there is this group that's working to then harmonize things. So that's where most of the alignment's coming. I'd say a lot of things are being borrowed from the RICS version 2 and all the great work that Jane and her team's done. So I guess we're seeing some movement forward, potentially duplicative efforts, but hopefully that will come to some consensus here in the next 5-10 years is my viewpoint.
Nice, thank you. Another question for Katie. Will the standard inform government regulation?
So on that question, it's not the sort of goal of the standard that it becomes legislation. However, because it's a voluntary standard, so people can choose to try and pursue it. But what we are hoping is that, again, our sort of methodology and our definitions can be used to inform the development of policy. And we know that it's part of the government's long-term plan to meet net zero carbon. So the standard will then be available as a resource to sort of set a trajectory in legislation to achieve that. We are also engaging with different people from different organisations of the government, like DESNES and DeLuc, keeping them up to date on what we're doing in the standard. So we hope that through that engagement as well, that they're aware and can think about how to incorporate our measures and methodology.
Thank you. Another question for Jane. Are there plans to check compliance of tools with the RICS standard?
Yes, that I can confirm that RICS are looking at that. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And then finally, probably until I see some other Q&A questions come in, Leonardo, we've got a question from a regulatory point of view. What type of data is needed to move from results reporting to carbon cap regulations? What are the drivers and enablers for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Katie already touched on this because it's something that I'm sure she mentioned whilst, you know, just laying out the next steps. And I mean, she kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's absolutely data availability to make things reasonable. Now, thinking of going from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time can be sometimes ambitious, and perfection obviously stops us from being very good. So there are steps, intermediary steps that we can take and focus our attention on the big hitters from a building perspective. So building elements perspective and from a life cycle modules perspective. So gather data on the big ticket items, establish a limit on those as a starting point whilst collecting the data, and then build the full data set to get to a whole building benchmark. For sure, that would be a good approach. And the main enabler is to get data and to get to get more data as much as possible. And that's the reason why the GLA has expects you to report results, and that's why a lot of regulations start with LCA reporting before going straight to carbon caps. But that again doesn't stop us from focusing our attention on those key items and focusing our efforts towards that. So yeah, that would be my answer.
Cool. Thank you. And one last one last point from Jane about Part Z, which was touched on.
Yeah, I just want
Yeah.
to say, so, I mean, it would be absolutely lovely if government had committed to Part Z by 2026, but no. As far as I know, there's no endorsement by government. It's an industry initiative. It's a suggestion of what future regulation could look like. But government have merely said that they will consult at some point in the future. And that's as far as they've gone. So at the moment, we don't see anything coming.
Right.
But that may all change on the 4th of July.
Very true. Yes. Okay, we have one more question, which I'm going to give to Jay, and then we'll close up. How do you see embodied carbon being integrated more and more into the design processes in the US? Do you foresee that clients are increasingly being aware of it and therefore asking it for it?
Yeah, so probably the biggest difference between the UK and the US markets is in the UK, a lot of it is many times it's owner driven, whereas in the US, it is very rarely owner driven. So addressing embodied carbon is been taken on by individual design firms, and that's where the commitment programs have come about, where we see that bottom up way of addressing embodied carbon. So I'd say it's still in its infancy. We have our early adopters. We have about 170 firms. I don't know the exact number that have been committed on the SC 2050. And that's where we're starting to see those firms begin to integrate embodied carbon assessments into their design process. It's not going to be on every project though. So it's still little by little, and that's where the hope of the pre-standard is to give the engineers the tools and the methodology to start adding it to their tool belt. So that way they can begin measuring it and then start reducing it near term. But yeah, some clients are more aware of it. It's slower than we would like to. Then I think the progress is slower than what's needed to actually achieve climate targets in the US. But as Leonardo mentioned, policy is accelerating. Yet most of the policy isn't at the asset level; it's at the procurement side of things.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, in session 1.